Hello. I thought that in the light of the number of people who have decided to do the Bible in a year from our church at St. Nicholas, that it might be helpful to provide short introductions to each of the books of the Bible. So that's what these videos are. What I've decided to do is that I'm going to take each book of the Bible and I'm going to ask three questions of it, three simple questions, which I hope the answering of those questions will provide a little bit of context to the book of the Bible that you're reading. So those three questions are who, that is, who wrote the book, when was it written, and why. So using the answers to who and when to try and come up with some answers as to why they might have written it. So I'm going to start with the book of Genesis. Who? As we'll find when asking this question of many of the books of the Hebrew Scriptures, the answer is quite complicated. Now, the traditional view is that Genesis, along with the next four books of the Bible, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were written by Moses, who is the character who takes over as the hero of the overarching narrative of those five books at the start of Exodus. So he doesn't appear in Genesis at all. The book of Genesis itself doesn't actually make any assertions regarding its authorship, and it's highly unlikely that the ancient readers of the text would have been interested in the question at all. There's also the fact that at the end of Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Torah, we are told the story of Moses' death, which means that at the very least he can't have written that bit of the first five books. Now, in the late 19th century, the question of authorship was becoming more important to the contemporary reader, and a theory which was going to become universally accepted for over a century by scholars was posited, that the first five books of the Hebrew Scriptures were drawn from at least four other pre-existing sources. These sources were given letters. The letters they were given were J, E, P, and D. Now, each of these sources had an author who was sort of lost in the mists of time, each with a different theology and agenda. Thus, the first five books of the Bible were understood as a kind of a patchwork book, knitting together these four strands. Genesis was seen as a combination of the J and E sources. Now, in your English translations of Genesis, you'll notice that God is sometimes referred to as Lord, using capital letters, Lord, and sometimes referred to as God. The former of these, the Lord reference, is thought to derive from the J source, and the latter the E source. So just by looking at the different names for God in the book of Genesis, you can see why scholars might have had this sort of patchwork theory. However, the documentary hypothesis is losing its universal power as scholars increasingly want to treat Genesis as a unified document, perhaps one that draws its material from a variety of places, but which can be seen as the result of one organizing mind. When? The narrative of Genesis begins at the dawn of time, and at this point in the book it has a universal scope. And then this narrows down to focus on the Middle East with the stories of Adam and Eve and the flood, before in chapter 11 we're introduced to our heroes, Abraham and Sarah. And the rest of the book, from chapter 11 onward, deals with these characters and their offspring. And it ends on a sort of a cliffhanger as Abraham's grandson Jacob and his family relocate to the land of Egypt. These stories are ancient stories, and prior to the introduction of Abraham in the book, they're likely to be reinterpretations and adaptations of ancient myths and oral traditions. There are similar, although not identical, stories that originate from other ancient Near Eastern cultures, and it sort of indicates that the different ancient groups were talking both to themselves and to each other through their stories. And it's interesting to note the differences, the different emphases in the ancient myths. Once we get to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, there are a couple of themes that emerge. The themes of being strangers in a foreign land, or of being pilgrims between one home and another. And these themes grow stronger throughout the book. Genesis also asks where relations with other people groups fit into relations with God. Are foreigners good or bad? How do we relate to them? If we ask ourselves when in Israel's history it was important to establish the difference between their creation stories and the creation stories of other local peoples, if we ask when in Israel's history was it encouraging to dwell on the times in the past when they'd been strangers or pilgrims, we might arrive at the conclusion that Genesis was written at some time during the Israelite exile in Babylon in the 6th century BC. This is the current thinking among biblical scholars, and it does shed some light on the contents of the book of Genesis, without ruling out the possibility that the stories it contains could indeed date back to the time of Moses, although Moses didn't write the book, and may relate a history based in the real events of Moses' life. Why? If Genesis was written during the exile in Babylon, there are a couple of purposes that it may have served. Firstly, it would have given them hope. The book begins with stories that affirm God's sovereignty over history. God created the world. It wasn't, as it is in other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, created in a conflict between equal and opposite powers. There's no chance that God will be overcome by creation at some point in time if we read the Hebrew creation story. There's also hope in the stories of Abraham and his ancestors. They were exiles, yet God made these exiles into a nation. So, for those exiled in Babylon, there's a possibility that the end of their journey may be the same. Secondly, Genesis asks the Israelites how they regard the foreigner in whose land they're living. Genesis isn't a nationalist book. God created the whole world. Equally, the foreign characters in Genesis are a mixed bunch. They're not all evil and they're not all good. And as such, they should be treated with some respect. And we see this in stories such as the story of Abimelech in chapters 20 and 21. So Genesis is a book written to give hope to a people in exile, to teach them that their treaties with their neighbours are imperative to living a good life in their land, and to reassure them that despite their current plight, God is in control.